There is an idea that plot is the story, but that is only part of what makes plot important. Without plot, there is no story, because it acts as a map moving from start to finish. It traces the actions of the story from one moment to the next until there is a final scene. The easiest way to think about plot is like a traditional stage play. It is broken up into 3 acts, with a beginning, middle, and ending. The first act sets up the characters, the setting, the conflict, and sometimes the meaning behind the story. The second act is the rising action, where most of the story takes place. The final act is sometimes broken into 2 parts. The first is the climax, when choices must be made, and the conflicts faced. In an action-adventure story, it would be when the good guy and the bad guy have a final battle. The second part of the third act is the resolution. It explains how things have changed or characters have grown by learning to face their challenges. The Newberry Honor book, Hatchet, by author Gary Paulsen, is about a young boy trying to survive after a plane crash. It contains 3 acts, with the plane crash, surviving alone in a forest, and trying to be rescued. The plot contains what the author wants to say about youth growing up, dealing with divorce, and loneliness. This is the first part of a discussion about the book's plot, starting with the first act. It will show how the author sets up the conflicts, introduces the main character, Brian Robinson, and describes a setting that becomes so important to moving the plot forward. Hello, and welcome to NDM English. My name is Nate, and these are my notes. The book starts with the 13-year-old Brian Robinson in a plane heading across what can only be considered a wilderness. All he hears is the drone of the airplane engine and seeing lots of green trees. We as readers are in a way travelers on the same plane as we're introduced to the setting. Very soon after the setting is described, one of the major conflicts is introduced by the word divorced. Brian's parents have divorced and he is on his way to visit with his dad. If it wasn't for this divorce, he probably would be safely at home and not in the airplane. Connecting this to the divorce is another conflict that Brian has to emotionally contend with. He calls this the secret because he witnessed something that he has not shared with anyone, not even his dad. In fact, he is fearful that revealing this secret to his dad will only make what he cannot control, the divorce, even worse. Much of Brian's behavior through the beginning of the story is based on this secret and how angry it makes him. Is the secret and the divorce that incites the action, or in other words, gets the plot started. Everything that happens from now on is related to this divorce. It doesn't take long before the secret is revealed. Observant readers could probably guess what happens long before the short story of the secret is told. The importance of the secret is not that it happened. What it does to Brian's emotions and how he reacts is far more important. This secret and the divorce does more than set up the plot. It allows us to see into the mind and heart of the main character. We know that Brian is upset. We know that Brian is angry. We know he's very confused and lost in his life. After the setting, we now know the main character. The plot can move forward from here, although we are still in the first act. The flying scene and description of witnessing his mother doing something upsetting is the setup for the rest. With all the information out of the way, the real story can now start. The reader might think that the heart attack is what sets things in motion, but the real start of the opening act is when the pilot briefly allows Brian to fly the plane. This short lesson foreshadows what Brian must do after the pilot has had the heart attack. The reader can then believe that this boy, who had never flown, is able to take control when it becomes necessary. If he had never touched the plane's controls, even for that minute of a lesson, then it would be very hard to believe that he could fly at all. That brief pilot lesson on how to fly is a foreshadowing of what Brian will have to do on his own. Remember, foreshadowing is when an event prepares or hints at another event that will take place in the future. In this case, Brian having to take the responsibility of landing the plane. 2 other loan words, fights and split, related to the secret and divorce, is introduced to describe how traumatic the divorce was between the mother and father. There's no details about what brought the divorce other than what Brian witnessed, but with those words, the reader can imagine the scenes of disagreements and yelling. The word split can mean a clean break between the two. The word fight, of course, is self-explanatory. In fact, there's an emphasis on how the mother and father have become completely separated from each other. Brian will never again see them together. He will live with his mother during the school days and his father during the summer. This plane ride is the first time he will be living alone with his father. He has to travel by plane from his mother to get to his father. This is a long distance, and one that again demonstrates how far apart his mother and father have become emotionally. In the story, this distance is because his father finds a job and has to move. What it does for the reader is make one more mental image of a relationship that is so damaged that a huge forest stands between them. Where is Brian in all this? Stuck in the middle and forced to watch his mother and father distance themselves from each other. That cannot be easy for the boy, and it certainly isn't. He is completely damaged and having a hard time coming to grips with the reality of the divorce. He is the only remaining bridge between his mother and father, having to be shared between them instead of living together as a family, and this makes him very upset. Of the two parents, he seems angry at his mother the most. She is the one who he saw the secret, and she is the one who got the divorce. There's a scene where the mother drops him off at the airport. His mother uses the word father, and Brian thinks that the word dad should have been used to describe him instead. Father and dad mean the same thing, and Brian knows that. But for him, there's a difference in the two words. Father is more distant and formal. Using the word dad is casual and gives an impression of an emotional connection and a closeness. Notice that he never wants to replace mother with the word mom, even though it would seem to have the same emotional meaning. He most likely still loves her, but there is hints that he blames her for everything that is going on at the moment. Whatever she was like before the divorce, she has become like a stranger to him. There's not that same closeness like is hinted at about his dad. The events and conversation in the plane ride mirrors the car ride with his mother to the airport. As explained before, Brian and the pilot fly over a wilderness with only the sound of the engine. There's no talking or discussions. The pilot looks forward, and Brian looks out the side window. Same with the car ride. His mother drives, and he looks out as a passenger. No words are exchanged. The pilot is nothing more in the mind of Brian than an extension of the airplane. He's a machine whose job it is to fly from point A to point B to live with his dad. The mother is the same way. She is part of the machine that has brought Brian to this point in his life. She is no better than the lawyers and the judges who explained the situation of the divorce, with lots of words and pretend feelings. They don't show any care about the boy. They are doing their jobs, and he is along for the ride. Any attention given to the boy is because he is there, and they must deal with that fact. If he wasn't there, they would still continue to do what it is that they must in their jobs. His father and mother would get a divorce. The lawyers and judges would split them up. The pilot would fly someone else, perhaps, somewhere else. Life would go on without him. It is a lesson that he would learn later on in the book, once completely stranded. Once the pilot dies from a heart attack, Brian changes the words that he uses. Single words that linked to the divorce are now replaced by words related to the airplane crash. The first word is stopped, when Brian cannot believe that the pilot is dead. He cannot emotionally breathe, or think what to do, or even feel his heart pounding in panic. At that moment in time, his world has stopped and could easily be ended. Once again, the description of the plane ride can also be describing what is going on in his life. Safety and security has been replaced by doubt and fear. His life, like the plane crash he now faces, has come to a complete stop that he doesn't know how to handle. The next word to show up is alone, because there's no one else on the plane. From the time when the pilot died, it is Brian who must save himself. With some looking around and struggling, he does make contact with ground control, but this doesn't help. At first, he doesn't know if anyone can even hear him. Once he realizes that he has to flip a switch on the radio to hear others, he doesn't know enough about flying to explain his needs. Whoever is on the end of the transmission isn't coming in clear. There's communication without any actual information getting exchanged. Soon there are no words at all, as the airport loses contact. Despite having no radio signal, Brian checks back every 15 minutes in the hopes of getting a response. There never is any. He is alone. There is no one to talk with. There is no one to save him. The only one he can turn to for help is himself. Again, this is similar to having to deal with the divorce. All he hears from anyone is a one-way communication. They might talk to him for a moment, but his own talking falls on deaf ears. Brian is constantly in denial from the start to the end of the crash. Although he knows that the pilot has had a heart attack, he imagines that the man is asleep. When he does accept that the pilot had a heart attack, he refuses to acknowledge the seriousness by using the correct wording. Instead, he calls what happened to the man "hit that way" as a replacement. The shock of a physical danger is too much for the already emotionally compromised boy. He does eventually get control of his fear and somewhat flight the plane, but that won't be the only time he separates himself from what is really going on. Once he crashes the plane, he hears screams coming from someone, and he isn't sure who that would be. The pilot is already dead, so it can't come from him. Only later, after the shock of the events, does he realize that he was the one who was screaming. After swimming in the lake to reach a beach once the plane has hit the water, he still has a problem coming to grips with reality. It all seems a bad dream to him, despite the physical evidence of the truth. He questions if this is all part of his imagination, and in a short time, he will be home and everything will be back to normal. This again is similar to when he first saw The Secret, and how he tried to block that from his memory. Soon after witnessing his mother with a stranger, all he could remember was fragments of that time. Later, when the seriousness of the situation was forced on him, he could remember every detail of that moment. It was now permanently stuck in his brain. It turned his life upside down, and because of that, it cannot be forgotten. From the moment that the plane hit the water in an emergency landing, there's evidence that life had completely changed again. After swimming for his survival, Brian sees nothing but trees and plants. In his normal life, he was surrounded by humans and buildings and activity. Once again, he was living experiences he never expected or was never taught how to handle. Where he might have heard cars and humans talking in a city, this was replaced by natural sounds of birds and wind in the trees. The early morning hours introduced him to the first new conflict of the forest. Swarms of bugs surrounded him and bit at his exposed flesh. He tried desperately to wave them away or cover his body, but they kept coming without any relief. This was a sign it was not a dream. He would have a difficult time with limited tools. The only real tool he had, other than the clothing that he was wearing, was the hatchet his mother gave him in the car. He may not have liked the gift when his mother gave it to him, but it will be the thing that will save his life. That is also similar to what the pilot gave Brian with a very short lesson on flying. It was a minimal amount of effort. It was just enough to keep him from dying in a plane crash. The hatchet is a minimal tool to build shelter, make fire, and keep him from dying of hunger or worse. He had to land the plane alone. He has to use the hatchet alone. He also has to learn to accept the divorce alone. The first act introduced the setting, the character, and the story, and will soon come to an end. The main conflict of survival in a forest is now becoming the focus. Before the second act starts, Brian still has to make some major decisions. He could sit next to a tree and wait for rescue. It is an idea that crosses his mind until terrible thirst forces him into action. Drinking water from the nearby lake makes him hungry. This makes him think of rescue again, and the possibility of eating a hamburger after returning. He could be rescued that evening, or the next day, or worst of all, never. The book prepares the reader for the story moving forward by having Brian go over his experiences up to that point. He talks about who he is, that he went to visit his father, that the plane crashed in the forest, and that no one is around. Brian is also motivated by the memory of a teacher from his past. His English teacher told him to think positive, stay on top of things, to keep him working towards success. It's an attitude that has been introduced that will help keep the character active and moving so that the plot can also go forward. Having lived through the plane crash, reaching dry land, and being irritated by bugs, he will have to deal with the main conflict of the story, finding shelter, food, and water to survive in the hopes of getting rescued. Question for discussion. Was the start of the story on the first page, the heart attack, the plane crash, Brian alone in the wilderness, or some other place? Click the subscribe button and notification bell to not miss the next installments and analysis.